The flames danced like vengeful spirits across the horizon, turning the once peaceful Kansas prairie into a hellscape of red and orange. Rachel Wilson clutched her swollen belly as she stumbled through the tall grass, each labored breath stinging her lungs with smoke and fear. 6 months pregnant and alone, she had only one thought: survive for the child within her. The year was 1872, and Hays City, Kansas, had been her home for only 3 weeks when disaster struck. A prairie fire, whipped into a frenzy by the relentless summer winds, now threatened to devour everything in its path, including her and the life she carried. Rachel had never imagined herself in this position. At 24 years old, widowed and expecting, she had come west to start anew with her aunt, only to find her relative's small homestead empty upon arrival. With dwindling funds, she'd taken a job as a schoolteacher in Hays City, hoping to build a life for herself and her child. Now, as she fled from the advancing flames, the cruel irony of escaping one tragedy only to face another wasn't lost on her. "Keep moving," she gasped to herself, one hand steadying her balance against a rock formation while the other remained protectively wrapped around her middle. The heat at her back grew more intense with each passing moment. Miles away, at the Galloway Ranch on the outskirts of Hays City, Henry Galloway stood on his porch, watching the distant glow of orange against the darkening sky with mounting concern. At 32, he'd seen prairie fires before, but this one moved with unnatural speed. "Jenkins," he called to his foreman, "get the men. That fire's heading straight for town, and we need to establish a fire break now." "Already on it, boss," Jenkins replied, already gathering the ranch hands. "But there's word from Simmons that there might be folks trapped out near Settlers Creek." Henry's jaw tightened as he reached for his hat and gloves. "Who? Not sure. Possibly that new schoolteacher, the widow woman. She was visiting the Petersons' place today to inquire about boarding for next term." Henry knew the Petersons' place a good 15 miles out and directly in the fire's path. Without another word, he strode toward the stables. "You ain't thinking of riding out there?" Jenkins called after him. "Someone has to," Henry replied, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. He'd lost his own wife and unborn child to fever 3 years ago. The thought of another woman facing death alone, especially one with child, was unbearable. He saddled Thunder, his most reliable stallion, and filled his canteens. "Keep the men working on that fire break. If I'm not back by dawn, don't come looking." Jenkins nodded grimly. They both knew what that meant. Henry spurred Thunder into a gallop, heading east toward where the fire burned brightest. The wind carried ash and embers that stung his face, and he pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth. As he rode, the sky darkened further, not with night but with smoke that blotted out the stars. Rachel had managed to reach Settlers Creek, but her hope quickly turned to despair. The creek, usually a reliable source of water, had dwindled to little more than a muddy trickle after weeks of drought. It would offer no protection from the approaching wall of flame. She collapsed on the bank, exhaustion and desperation overwhelming her. Her dress was torn, her hands bloody from falls, and her throat raw from smoke. The baby kicked frantically within her, as if sensing the danger they faced. "I'm sorry, little one," she whispered, tears cutting clean streaks down her ash-covered face. "I tried." The roar of the fire grew louder, drowning out even her thoughts. Rachel closed her eyes, preparing for the inevitable, when suddenly another sound cut through the chaos: hoofbeats, fast and purposeful. Henry spotted her through the smoky haze, a figure in a faded blue dress huddled by the creek bed. Relief surged through him, immediately followed by urgency as he saw how close the flames had come. He pushed Thunder harder, feeling the horse's muscles strain beneath him. "Madam," he shouted as he approached. "Madam, can you stand?" Rachel looked up, disbelieving. Through the smoke and darkness emerged a man on horseback, his face obscured by a bandana, his hat pulled low. For a wild moment, she thought he might be a hallucination born of desperation. "Yes," she managed to croak, struggling to her feet. Henry dismounted in one fluid motion, crossing the distance between them in long strides. "I'm Henry Galloway. I've come to get you out of here." Rachel Wilson, she replied automatically, then added with urgency, I'm with child. His eyes, the only part of his face visible above his bandana, softened with understanding. I can see that, Mrs. Wilson. Don't worry, I'll get you both to safety. Without further discussion, he helped her onto Thunder, then swung up behind her. One strong arm wrapped securely around her waist, holding her steady against him. Hold tight to the saddle horn, he instructed. Thunder knows his job, but the going will be rough, Rachel nodded, too exhausted and grateful to speak. As Henry turned the horse westward, she realized with horror that the fire had circled around them. The path back to town was now blocked by a wall of flame. We can't go back that way, she said, panic rising in her voice. I know, Henry replied, his voice calm despite the dire situation. There's an old riverbed to the north. If we can reach it, we might find a way through. He spurred Thunder forward, and the stallion responded with remarkable courage, racing parallel to the fire line. Rachel clutched the saddle horn with one hand, the other still protectively over her belly. The heat was becoming unbearable, the air so thick with smoke that each breath felt like swallowing fire. Then suddenly, the wind shifted. What had been a small advantage became an immediate threat as the flames leapt ahead of them, cutting off their path to the riverbed. Henry assessed their situation with the practiced eye of someone who had survived the unforgiving frontier. They were trapped, with fire closing in from three sides. The only option was to ride through a narrow gap where the flames were less intense. Mrs. Wilson, he said, his mouth close to her ear to be heard over the fire's roar, we're going to have to ride through. Keep your head down, hold your breath when I tell you, and trust me. Rachel nodded, fear and determination warring within her. I trust you, Mr. Galloway. Henry tightened his arm around her, ensuring she was secure, then whispered a few words of encouragement to Thunder. The horse's ears flicked back, listening before he steadied himself. Now, Henry shouted, spurring Thunder forward into a full gallop, the world became an inferno. Heat seared Rachel's skin, smoke blinded her, and the roar deafened her. She squeezed her eyes shut, buried her face against Henry's chest, and held her breath as instructed. Thunder's powerful muscles bunched and stretched beneath them as the brave animal charged through the gap in the flames. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Rachel was certain they would perish. Then suddenly, the heat lessened, the roar receded, and cool air rushed into her lungs as she gasped for breath. We made it, Henry said, relief evident in his voice as he slowed Thunder to a more sustainable pace. Are you all right? Rachel couldn't speak immediately, overcome by the realization that they had survived. When she finally found her voice, it shook with emotion. Yes, you saved us. I don't know how to thank you. No thanks needed, Henry replied, guiding Thunder toward a small rise where they could rest briefly and get their bearings. I couldn't leave you out there. As they crested the rise, Rachel got her first clear look at their surroundings. The fire still raged behind them, but they had indeed broken free of its deadly embrace. Ahead lay rolling prairie, bathed silver in the moonlight that now pierced through thinning smoke. Henry helped her down from Thunder, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Now that the immediate danger had passed, Rachel became acutely aware of her disheveled appearance and the intimate way they had been forced to ride together. You're the new schoolteacher, Henry said, recognition dawning in his eyes as he pulled down his bandana. I saw you in town last Sunday at the church service. Rachel nodded, surprised he had noticed her. I arrived only 3 weeks ago. I was supposed to start teaching next month when the school term begins. Henry untied his canteen and offered it to her. Drink slowly, he advised. We're not out of danger yet. That fire could shift again and we're still a good distance from town. Rachel sipped the water gratefully, feeling it soothe her parched throat. As she handed the canteen back, a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, causing her to gasp and double over. Henry was at her side instantly, concern etched on his face. Mrs. Wilson, what is it? The baby, she managed through clenched teeth. I think the stress might have started something. Alarm flashed in Henry's eyes. He knew enough about childbirth to understand that a baby coming this early was dangerous, especially under these conditions. How far along are you? he asked, helping her to sit on a flat rock. 6 months, Rachel replied, fear evident in her voice. It's too soon. Henry nodded, his mind racing through their limited options. They were at least 10 miles from Hayes City with a wildfire between them and town. The nearest homestead he knew of was his own ranch, about 7 miles to the northwest. Listen to me, Mrs. Wilson. We're going to get you to my ranch. I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, who's delivered more babies than the doctor in town, but I need to know if you think you can ride that far. Rachel closed her eyes, focusing on her body. The pain had subsided somewhat, but she could feel the baby moving restlessly. I think it was a false alarm, she said after a moment, but I'm not certain. We'll take it slow, Henry assured her, and stop whenever you need to, but we should get moving soon. He helped her back onto Thunder, then mounted behind her, keeping one arm securely around her while holding the reins with his free hand. They set off at a walk, with Henry constantly vigilant for signs of the fire changing direction or Rachel experiencing more pains. As they rode, the full moon illuminated the prairie around them, creating an almost ethereal landscape. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. May I ask about your husband, Mrs. Wilson? Henry ventured after they had ridden in silence for some time. Rachel tensed slightly, then relaxed. Thomas died 4 months ago. Typhoid. We were in St. Louis then. He never knew about the baby. Henry's arm tightened slightly around her in an instinctive gesture of comfort. I'm sorry for your loss. It's not easy losing someone you love. There was something in his voice that made Rachel turn her head slightly to look at him. You speak from experience. It wasn't a question, but Henry answered anyway. My wife, Margaret, died 3 years ago. She was expecting our first child. Rachel felt a profound connection form between them in that moment, two people who understood the particular pain of having dreams of family shattered. I'm sorry, Mr. Galloway. They fell silent again, each lost in memories, as Thunder carried them steadily northwest. The smell of smoke gradually lessened, though the orange glow remained visible on the horizon behind them. After nearly 2 hours of riding, Rachel spotted lights in the distance. Is that your ranch? She asked, hope rising within her. Yes, Henry confirmed. Galloway Ranch. It's not much to look at, but it's home. As they drew closer, Rachel could make out a substantial main house, a large barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. It was considerably more impressive than Henry's modest description had suggested. A woman with a lantern appeared on the porch as they approached, her gray hair visible in the lamplight. Mrs. Finch, Henry called out as he guided Thunder into the yard. We have need of your expertise. The older woman hurried down the steps, her expression changing from worry to determination as she took in Rachel's condition. Bring her inside, quickly. Jenkins told me you'd gone off to play hero. I've had water heating since you left, just in case. Henry dismounted first, then carefully helped Rachel down. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her, and without hesitation, he swept her into his arms. I can walk, Rachel protested weakly. Indulge me, Henry replied with a small smile that transformed his weather-beaten face. I didn't ride through fire just to have you collapse on my doorstep. Mrs. Finch led them inside to a well-appointed guest room on the first floor. Put her here, she directed. Then make yourself scarce while I examine her. Henry gently laid Rachel on the bed, their eyes meeting briefly before he stepped back. I'll be just outside if you need anything, he told her, then turned to Mrs. Finch. Take good care of them. After he left, Mrs. Finch helped Rachel out of her smoke-stained dress and into a clean nightgown that must have belonged to someone larger, as it accommodated her pregnant belly with room to spare. Now then, the housekeeper said as she helped Rachel into bed, let's see what's happening with that baby. After a thorough examination, Mrs. Finch's expression softened. You've had some false labor pains brought on by the stress, but your water hasn't broken and the baby seems content to stay put for now. Still, you'll need complete rest for at least a few days. Relief washed over Rachel. Thank you. I was so afraid. You're not out of the woods yet, Mrs. Finch cautioned, but with proper care you should be able to carry to term. Now I'm going to bring you some broth and tea and then you need to sleep. When Mrs. Finch opened the door to leave. Rachel saw Henry waiting in the hallway, his face lined with concern. "The baby's fine for now," Mrs. Finch told him, "but she needs rest and quiet." Henry nodded, visibly relieved. "May I speak with her briefly?" Mrs. Finch hesitated, then relented. 5 minutes. Then she eats and sleeps. Henry entered the room, his tall frame seeming too large for the delicate furnishings. He remained standing near the door as if uncertain of his welcome. "Mrs. Finch says you and the baby will be all right," he said. Rachel nodded. "Thanks to you. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you did tonight." Henry shook his head. "There's no debt. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Rachel said firmly. "Not anyone would have ridden into a wildfire to save a stranger. You risked your life for us, Mr. Galloway. I won't forget that." A slight flush colored Henry's tan cheeks. "Well, you're welcome to stay here as long as you need. When you're recovered enough, I can take you back to town, what's left of it, anyway." Alarm shot through Rachel. "The town, is it?" "I don't know yet," Henry admitted. "Jenkins will ride over at first light to assess the damage and check on everyone, but Hayes City has survived fires before." Rachel sank back against the pillows, suddenly overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "I've lost everything twice now," she murmured, more to herself than to Henry. He moved closer, hesitating before sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "Mrs. Wilson, Rachel, if I may, sometimes what seems like an ending is actually a beginning. I know that might not be much comfort now, but I've found it to be true." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection forged in shared grief and sudden danger. Then Mrs. Finch returned with a tray, and the moment broke. "Out," she commanded Henry. "This young woman needs nourishment and rest." Henry stood, giving Rachel a slight bow. "Good night, Mrs. Wilson. Sleep well." As the door closed behind him, Rachel found herself strangely reluctant to see him go. Despite everything, the fire, the fear, the pain, for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something like hope stirring within her. Dawn broke over the prairie, revealing the devastation the fire had left in its wake. Henry stood on his porch, surveying the blackened landscape to the east. The fire had been contained before it reached his property. Thanks to the firebreak his men had established and a providential shift in the wind. But beyond that line, the prairie was a charred wasteland. Jenkins rode in as the sun cleared the horizon, his horse lathered and his face grim. "How bad?" Henry asked without preamble. "Could have been worse," Jenkins replied, dismounting. "The fire skirted the northern edge of town, lost the Petersons' place and the old Miller homestead. 3 other outlying farms got singed but are mostly intact. No casualties reported yet, though some folks are still unaccounted for." Henry nodded, relief evident in his expression. "And the schoolhouse, standing, might need some repairs to the roof from flying embers, but otherwise intact." That was good news for Rachel, at least. She would still have a job when she recovered. "How's the schoolmarm?" Jenkins asked, as if reading Henry's thoughts. "Resting. Mrs. Finch says she'll be fine with time." Jenkins studied his boss's face with the knowing gaze of someone who had worked alongside him for years. "You did a brave thing riding out there like that. Damn foolish, but brave." Henry shrugged uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Jenkins contradicted. "Not anyone. Not many men would risk their lives for a woman they barely know, pregnant or otherwise." Before Henry could respond, Mrs. Finch appeared at the door. "Mr. Galloway, Mrs. Wilson is awake and asking to speak with you." Henry nodded to Jenkins, who gave him a knowing look before leading his horse toward the stable. Inside, Henry found Rachel sitting up in bed, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders and color returned to her cheeks. The sight of her, alive and well in the morning light, affected him more than he expected. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson. How are you feeling?" he asked, remaining near the door. "Much better, thank you," she replied. "Mrs. Finch has been wonderful, but I'm concerned about imposing on your hospitality." Henry shook his head. "It's no imposition. Jenkins just returned from town. The schoolhouse is still standing, but it will be some time before it's safe for you to return. The land between here and town is still smoking in places." Relief and concern chased across Rachel's expressive face. "And the people, was anyone hurt?" "No casualties reported," Henry assured her. Though the Petersons lost their home, Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. Oh no. They were so kind to me yesterday. They had invited me to stay with them while teaching, and Mr. Peterson insisted on driving me back toward town when we saw the smoke. I made him turn back to save himself when we realized how quickly the fire was moving. Her eyes widened suddenly. Is Mr. Peterson all right? Yes, Henry said. Jenkins says he's with his sister's family in town. Rachel closed her eyes briefly in relief. Thank goodness. There was a moment of awkward silence before Henry spoke again. Mrs. Wilson, I want you to know that you're welcome to stay here until you're fully recovered and it's safe to return to town. I have plenty of room, and Mrs. Finch would appreciate the female company. Rachel studied him, her green eyes thoughtful. You're very kind, Mr. Galloway. But I wouldn't want to be a burden. You're not, he said simply. Besides, your health and the baby's come first. Rachel placed a hand on her belly, a tender gesture that Henry found unexpectedly moving. Thank you. I accept your offer, at least until I can make other arrangements. Henry nodded, pleased. Good, now if you feel up to it, Mrs. Finch has prepared breakfast. I'm famished, actually, Rachel admitted with a small smile. I'll have her bring you a tray. No, Rachel interrupted. I'd like to get up and join you if that's all right. I've spent enough time in bed. Henry hesitated. Are you sure you're strong enough? I'm pregnant, not invalid, Rachel replied with a hint of spirit that made Henry smile. Besides, I've been told I need to walk a little each day for the baby's sake. Very well, Henry conceded. I'll wait outside while you dress. Mrs. Finch left some clothes that might fit you. 10 minutes later, Rachel emerged from the room wearing a simple calico dress that hung a bit loosely on her frame, except where it stretched across her belly. Her hair was neatly braided, and despite the ordeal of the previous night, she carried herself with dignity. Henry offered his arm, which she took with only a slight hesitation. The dining room is this way. As they walked slowly down the hallway, Henry was acutely aware of her presence beside him, the subtle floral scent that somehow remained despite the smoke, the warmth of her hand on his arm, the soft sound of her breathing. It had been a long time since a woman other than Mrs. Finch had walked these halls. The dining room was bright with morning sunlight streaming through large windows. A table set for two awaited them, laden with biscuits, bacon, eggs, and fresh coffee. Mrs. Finch has outdone herself, Rachel remarked as Henry held her chair. She tends to cook enough for an army whenever we have guests, Henry explained, taking his own seat across from her, which isn't often. As they ate, conversation flowed more easily than either had expected. Rachel told him about growing up in Ohio, meeting Thomas at a church social, and their plans to start a farm before illness took him. Henry spoke of establishing his ranch 10 years earlier, building it from nothing into one of the most successful operations in the area. Neither mentioned their lost spouses again, though the ghosts of those absences hovered at the edges of their words. How did you end up in Hayes City? Henry asked as they finished their meal. Rachel sipped her tea before answering. My Aunt Beatrice moved here 5 years ago after her husband died. She wrote to me regularly, describing the town and the need for teachers. When Thomas passed, I wrote to tell her I was coming west, but when I arrived, her homestead was abandoned. Henry frowned. Beatrice Wilson. Small woman, always wore a blue bonnet to church. Rachel nodded, surprised. You knew her. Everyone knew Aunt B, Henry said gently. I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson, but your aunt passed away last winter, pneumonia. The whole town attended her funeral. Rachel set down her cup, her hand trembling slightly. I feared as much when I found the homestead empty. The neighbors weren't certain, only that she'd been taken ill and then the place was abandoned. She sighed deeply. At least now I know for sure. Thank you for telling me. Henry watched her process this final confirmation of her aunt's death, admiring her composure. Your aunt was well respected in town. She helped establish the school where you'll be teaching. This brought a small smile to Rachel's lips. She always valued education. It's fitting that I'll continue her work. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Finch, who entered with a concerned expression. Mr. Galloway, Dr. Maxwell is here. He says there's trouble in town. Henry rose immediately, "Excuse me, Mrs. Wilson," in the foyer, doctor. Maxwell, a man in his 50s with a shock of white hair and perpetually worried eyes, waited impatiently. "Galloway, thank God," he said when Henry appeared. "We need your help in town. The fire damaged more than we initially thought. The church roof collapsed during the night, and we've got people with nowhere to go. Mayor's organizing relief efforts, but we need supplies, food, blankets, medicine." Henry nodded decisively. "I'll send what I can spare. Jenkins can load up the wagons and be there by noon." "There's more, doctor." Maxwell added grimly, "We've had reports of looters. Some unsavory characters are taking advantage of the chaos." Henry's jaw tightened. "I'll come myself with some of the men. We'll help keep order." The doctor nodded gratefully. "I heard you rescued the new school teacher. How is she?" "Recovering well," Henry replied. "She'll stay here until it's safe for her to return." Dr. Maxwell raised an eyebrow but made no comment. "I'd like to examine her before I go, if that's all right. Pregnant women need special care after such ordeals." "Of course," Henry agreed. "She's in the dining room." After introducing the doctor to Rachel, Henry excused himself to organize the relief supplies and select men to accompany him to town. By the time he returned, Dr. Maxwell was preparing to leave. "Mrs. Wilson and the baby are doing remarkably well, considering what they've been through," the doctor informed Henry. "But I've advised her to remain on bed rest for at least another day and to avoid any strenuous activity for a week afterward." "I'll make sure she follows your instructions," Henry promised. Dr. Maxwell packed his bag. "See that you do. I'll return in a few days to check on her progress." After the doctor left, Henry found Rachel back in the guest room, sitting in a rocking chair by the window. She looked troubled. "Doctor." "Maxwell says you're healing well," Henry said by way of greeting. Rachel nodded absently. "Yes, we're both fine." She turned to him, her expression serious. "He told me about the situation in town. I feel terrible sitting here safe and comfortable while others have lost their homes." "There's nothing you could do even if you were there," Henry pointed out, "and you have your child to think about." "I know," Rachel sighed, "but I can't help feeling useless." Henry considered for a moment. "Perhaps there is something you could do. We're sending supplies to town: food, blankets, clothing. Would you help Mrs. Finch organize everything? Nothing strenuous, just directing what goes where." Rachel's face brightened immediately. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Henry smiled, pleased to see her spirits lifted. "Good. I'll have Jenkins help you to the sitting room. Mrs. Finch has already started gathering items." For the next few hours, Rachel sat in a comfortable chair in the sitting room, directing the organization of supplies. Despite her condition, she proved remarkably efficient, creating an inventory system that impressed even the practical Mrs. Finch. By midday, 2 wagons were loaded and ready to depart. Henry came to find Rachel before leaving. "We'll distribute these in town and assess the situation," he explained. "I may not return until tomorrow, depending on how bad things are." Rachel looked up from the list she was checking. "Please be careful. Dr. Maxwell mentioned looters." Henry was touched by her concern. "Don't worry about me. I've dealt with worse than opportunistic thieves." "Still," Rachel insisted, "take care." Their eyes held for a long moment, neither quite able to name the connection forming between them. "I'll leave 2 men here," Henry said finally, "just as a precaution. The ranch is well out of danger from the fire now, but with strangers about." Rachel nodded her understanding. "We'll be fine. Mrs. Finch is formidable enough to deter any troublemakers." This drew a genuine laugh from Henry. "That she is. I'll see you tomorrow then." As he turned to go, Rachel called after him, "Mr. Galloway, thank you for everything." Henry touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then was gone. The remainder of the day passed quietly for Rachel. True to Dr. Maxwell's instructions, she rested frequently, though she found herself restless without Henry's presence. It surprised her how quickly she had grown accustomed to him, how comfortable she felt in his home. That evening, after a light supper with Mrs. Finch, Rachel sat in the parlor, leafing through one of Henry's books, a collection of poetry that showed signs of frequent reading, with certain pages dog-eared and passages underlined. "He reads that one often," Mrs. Finch remarked as she entered with tea. Rachel closed the book, slightly embarrassed at being caught examining such a personal item. I wouldn't have expected Mr. Galloway to enjoy poetry. Mrs. Finch set down the tea tray. There's a great deal about Mr. Galloway that might surprise you. He's not like other ranchers hereabouts. Rachel accepted a cup of tea. In what way? The older woman considered her answer carefully. He's educated, for one, went to university back east before coming west, could have been a lawyer or businessman, but he wanted to build something with his own hands. And his wife? Rachel asked, unable to contain her curiosity. He mentioned she died, but little else. Mrs. Finch's expression softened. Margaret was a city girl, Philadelphia born and bred, came west to teach, just like you. They were married barely a year when the fever took her and their unborn child. Nearly destroyed him. Rachel's hand instinctively went to her own belly, feeling the baby shift within. How terrible. He didn't speak for weeks after, Mrs. Finch continued, threw himself into work until he was exhausted enough to sleep without dreams. It's only in the last year that I've seen glimpses of the man he was before. Rachel stared into her tea, processing this information. I understand his grief. When Thomas died, I felt as though the future had been erased. If not for the baby, I might have given up entirely. Mrs. Finch studied her with shrewd eyes. Life has a way of giving us second chances, Mrs. Wilson, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. Before Rachel could respond to this pointed observation, a commotion outside drew their attention. Mrs. Finch moved to the window, peering out into the gathering dusk. Riders coming, she announced, her tone sharpening. And they're not our men. Rachel set down her tea, alarm replacing the contemplative mood of moments before. How many? 3, maybe 4. Can't tell in this light, Mrs. Finch replied. She turned to Rachel, suddenly all business. Go to your room and lock the door. Don't come out until I call for you. Rachel hesitated. But no arguments, Mrs. Finch insisted. If these are the looters the doctor mentioned, we don't want them knowing there's a vulnerable woman here. Go now. Rachel obeyed, hurrying to her room as quickly as her condition allowed. She locked the door behind her as instructed, then moved to the window where she could see the front yard. 4 men had indeed ridden up, their horses lathered and their appearance rough. They weren't cowboys or farmers, their city clothes and nervous manner marked them as outsiders. Through her partially open window, Rachel could hear Mrs. Finch on the porch, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. State your business, the housekeeper demanded. One man, taller than the others and wearing a bowler hat, stepped forward. We're looking for shelter, madam, lost our way after the fire. This isn't a hotel, Mrs. Finch replied coldly. Hayes City is 15 miles southeast. You'll find accommodation there. Now that's not very hospitable, the man said, his tone hardening. Big place like this must have room to spare, and we're awful tired. Rachel's heart raced as she recognized the threat underlying his words. Through the window, she could see Henry's 2 ranch hands appearing from the bunkhouse, rifles in hand but still distant. This is the Galloway Ranch, Mrs. Finch declared, standing her ground. Mr. Galloway doesn't welcome uninvited guests, especially those who arrive armed at nightfall. The leader's hand moved to his hip where a pistol was holstered. Maybe Mr. Galloway isn't as particular as you think. Where is he? Right behind you, came Henry's voice, strong and clear. Rachel nearly cried out with relief as Henry rode into the yard, flanked by 3 of his men. He had returned early and not a moment too soon. The 4 strangers whirled around, clearly surprised. Their leader recovered quickly, adopting a friendly demeanor that didn't reach his eyes. Evening, sir. We were just asking the lady here for a place to spend the night, got ourselves turned around after the fire. Henry dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. Even from a distance, Rachel could see the dangerous set of his shoulders, the careful way he positioned himself. As Mrs. Finch told you, this isn't a hotel, he said evenly. And honest men don't need to intimidate women to find lodging. The atmosphere in the yard crackled with tension. Rachel held her breath, watching the standoff and praying it wouldn't erupt into violence. The leader glanced at his companions, then back at Henry and his armed men. Slowly, his hand moved away from his pistol. Seems we've gotten off on the wrong foot. We'll be on our way. That would be wise, Henry agreed, his tone making it clear it wasn't a suggestion. The four men mounted their horses, the leader tipping his hat with mock politeness. No offense meant, Mr. Galloway, none taken, Henry replied, but if I see you on my property again, there will be. The strangers rode out, Henry's men following at a distance to ensure they left the ranch boundaries. As soon as they were gone from view, Rachel rushed from her room, ignoring Mrs. Finch's instructions in her relief. She hurried onto the porch just as Henry turned toward the house. "You're back early," she said, unable to keep the gladness from her voice. Henry's stern expression softened at the sight of her. "Fortunately so, are you all right?" "Yes, thanks to your timing," Rachel replied. "Those men, were they the looters?" Henry nodded grimly. "Likely the same ones who have been causing trouble in town. They won't be back here, but I'll keep extra men on watch tonight just to be sure." Mrs. Finch appeared at Rachel's side. "You shouldn't be up, Mrs. Wilson. Doctor's orders." "I'm fine," Rachel insisted, though in truth the excitement had left her feeling shaky. Henry noticed her pallor. "Mrs. Finch is right, you should rest." He offered his arm, which Rachel gratefully accepted. As they walked back inside, Rachel found herself leaning on him more than she had intended. By the time they reached her room, she was trembling slightly from exhaustion. "Those men frightened me more than I realized," she admitted as Henry helped her to a chair. "They're gone now," he assured her, "and they won't be bothering anyone else either. The sheriff was rounding them up when I left town." Rachel looked up at him in surprise. "You came back because of them?" Henry nodded, somewhat uncomfortably. "Word reached us that they were headed this way. I couldn't stay in town knowing they might come here." The implication that he had rushed back specifically to protect her hung in the air between them. "I thought of you too," Rachel confessed softly. "All day. It's strange, isn't it? We barely know each other." Henry's expression was unreadable, but his voice was gentle when he spoke. Sometimes circumstances reveal more about a person in hours than others might learn in years. Their eyes met, and Rachel felt the same connection that had sparked between them in the fire's aftermath stronger now, impossible to ignore. The moment was broken by Mrs. Finch calling for Henry from the hallway. He straightened, his hand lingering briefly on Rachel's shoulder before he stepped away. "Get some rest," he said. "We can talk more tomorrow." After he left, Rachel moved to the bed, her mind whirling with emotions she hadn't expected to feel again so soon after Thomas's death. Gratitude, certainly Henry had saved her life and possibly again tonight. But there was more, a warmth, a pull toward him that both excited and frightened her. As she drifted towards sleep, one thought kept returning. Henry Galloway was a man who rode through fire for strangers and returned early from town to protect a woman he barely knew. Such men were rare indeed. The next morning brought clear skies and a sense of calm to the ranch. Rachel woke feeling stronger than she had since the fire. After dressing in another of the borrowed dresses, she made her way to the dining room where she found Henry reviewing papers at the table. He rose when she entered, his face brightening. "Good morning. You look well rested." "I feel much better," Rachel replied, taking the seat he pulled out for her. "Any news from town?" Henry poured her a cup of coffee before answering. "The situation is improving. Most of the displaced families have found shelter with neighbors or at the hotel. Repairs to the damaged buildings will begin today." "And the schoolhouse?" Rachel asked hopefully. "Minor damage only. It should be ready before the term starts." Henry hesitated, then added, "Though Dr. Maxwell was quite firm that you shouldn't return to town for at least a week, possibly longer." Rachel sighed, resigned to the doctor's orders but chafing at the enforced idleness. "I suppose I have little choice. If it's any consolation, your presence here has been pleasant," Henry said, the slight hesitation revealing more than his words. Rachel felt a blush warm her cheeks. "Even though I arrived under such dramatic circumstances, especially because of those circumstances," Henry replied with unexpected candor. "They revealed your character, your courage and resilience." Before Rachel could respond to this earnest compliment, Mrs. Finch arrived with breakfast, effectively ending the private moment. The day passed companionably, with Rachel feeling well enough to take short walks in the garden with Henry. He showed her the ranch with evident pride, the stables where he bred some of the finest horses in Kansas, the small orchard his wife had started, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary where he sometimes fished in the early mornings. As they walked, they shared stories of their lives before the West claimed them. Henry spoke of his childhood in Virginia, his education at Harvard, and his decision to seek his fortune on the frontier rather than join his father's law practice. Rachel told him about her dreams of becoming a writer, how she had kept journals since childhood, and how teaching had become her way of sharing her love of words with others. "I still write," she admitted as they rested on a bench beneath an apple tree. "Nothing publishable, just observations, thoughts. It helps make sense of things." "Have you written about the fire?" Henry asked gently. Rachel shook her head. "Not yet, it's still too immediate." Henry nodded his understanding. "Some experiences need time to settle before we can shape them into words." Rachel studied him with new appreciation. "You understand the writer's mind better than most." "Margaret wrote poetry," he explained. "She taught me to value the power of words." The mention of his wife didn't bring the usual shadow to his eyes, Rachel noticed. Instead, there was a quiet fondness, as if the memory had transformed from raw pain to something he could hold more gently. "It's possible to honor those we've lost while still moving forward," Rachel observed. "I'm beginning to understand that now." Henry turned to look at her directly, his gaze searching. "Yes, it is." In that moment, surrounded by the peaceful garden, Rachel felt something shift between them, as if they both recognized the possibility of a future neither had anticipated. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Rachel's strength returned rapidly, and with it came a growing involvement in the daily life of the ranch. She took to helping Mrs. Finch with meal planning and household accounts, discovered a talent for organization that proved useful in Henry's cluttered office, and even began teaching the younger ranch hands to read during their evening rest periods. Henry found himself increasingly drawn to her presence. He enjoyed her quick mind, her genuine interest in his work, and the way she had somehow breathed new life into his home. Meals were no longer silent affairs, but occasions for conversation and even laughter. The evenings, once endured rather than enjoyed, became a time he looked forward to, when they might read together in the parlor or simply talk until Mrs. Finch pointedly reminded them of the hour. A week after the fire, Dr. Maxwell returned to examine Rachel. Henry waited anxiously in his study while the examination took place, unable to focus on the ledgers before him. When Mrs. Finch finally appeared at the door, he looked up expectantly. "The doctor says she's healing well," Mrs. Finch reported. "Both she and the baby are thriving, despite everything." Henry released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That's good news." Mrs. Finch gave him a knowing look. "He also says she's well enough to return to town whenever she wishes." This news, which should have been equally welcome, instead sent an unexpected pang through Henry's chest. "I see. The doctor is waiting to speak with you," Mrs. Finch added, turning to leave. "And if I might offer an observation, Mr. Galloway, sometimes the things we're most afraid to say are the very things that need saying." Henry frowned at this cryptic remark but rose to meet with the doctor. He found Dr. Maxwell in the foyer, bag in hand. "Mrs. Wilson has made a remarkable recovery," the doctor said without preamble. "She can return to town anytime, though I'd still advise against her living alone in her condition." Henry nodded, an idea forming in his mind. "Thank you for coming all this way, Doctor. May I ask one more favor?" "Of course." "Would you deliver a message to Mayor Williams? I'd like to discuss the possibility of establishing a proper medical clinic in Hays City. The fire has shown we need better emergency resources. Doctor." Maxwell's eyes widened with interest. "That's a generous offer, Galloway. I've been advocating for something similar for years." "Consider it a long overdue investment in the community," Henry replied. "I'll ride into town next week to discuss details." After the doctor departed, Henry sought out Rachel. He found her in the garden, seated on the bench under the apple tree, writing in a small notebook. She looked up at his approach, a smile spreading across her face. "Dr. Maxwell says I'm fully recovered," she announced. "Though he still insists I shouldn't live alone." Henry sat beside her, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since his courting days. "I've been thinking about that." Rachel closed her notebook, giving him her full attention. "Oh." "The school teacher's quarters attached to the schoolhouse are rather small," Henry began carefully. "And as you'll be increasing over the coming months, you'll need more space assistance." Rachel's expression was unreadable. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Galloway?" Henry took a deep breath. "I'm suggesting that you might consider staying here, permanently." Rachel's eyes widened. "As your housekeeper?" "No," Henry said quickly. "As my wife." The words hung in the air between them, bold and unexpected. Rachel stared at him, clearly stunned by the proposal. Henry rushed to explain. "I know it's sudden and perhaps presumptuous. We've known each other only a short time, but I've come to care for you, Rachel, deeply. And I believe you might feel something for me as well." Rachel remained silent, her expression conflicted. "I would care for you and your child as my own," Henry continued earnestly. "You would want for nothing. And while I don't expect you to love me as you loved Thomas, perhaps in time—" "Stop," Rachel said softly, placing her hand over his. "You're right that I've come to care for you. How could I not, after everything? But marriage is a serious commitment, Henry, for both of us." Henry turned his hand to clasp hers. "I've given it serious thought. I'm not acting on impulse or pity or obligation. When I rode into that fire to find you, something changed in me. And every day since has only confirmed what I began to feel that night." "And what is that?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That life has given us both a second chance," Henry answered simply, "and I don't want to waste it." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. "I never expected to feel this way again after Thomas died, to be drawn to someone, to imagine a future with them." Hope rose in Henry's chest. "Does that mean it means I need time?" Rachel interrupted gently. "Not to decide if I care for you. I do, more than I thought possible after such a short acquaintance. But to be certain this is right for both of us, and for my child." Henry nodded, respecting her caution even as his heart urged him to press his case. "Of course, take whatever time you need." "My offer stands." "I'll return to town tomorrow," Rachel said, seeing his disappointment. "The school term starts soon and I should prepare, but perhaps you could visit. We could continue to know each other better." Henry brightened at this suggestion. "I'd like that very much." Rachel smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "So would I." The next day, Henry drove Rachel to Hayes City in his buggy rather than sending her with one of his men. The journey gave them time together without the watchful eyes of Mrs. Finch or the ranch hands, and their conversation flowed easily despite the momentous questions still hanging between them. Hayes City showed signs of recovery from the fire. New lumber was stacked beside damaged buildings, and the streets bustled with activity. Several people called out greetings to Henry as they passed, their curious gazes lingering on Rachel beside him. The schoolhouse stood on a small rise at the edge of town, the attached teachers' quarters a modest but neat structure behind it. As Henry helped Rachel down from the buggy, the door to the main building opened, and a small delegation emerged. Mayor Williams, the school board chairman, and several women who appeared to be mothers of students. "Mrs. Wilson," the mayor greeted her warmly. "We're delighted to see you recovered from your ordeal, and we owe Mr. Galloway a debt of gratitude for his heroic rescue." Henry tipped his hat, uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "I think not," the chairman said dryly. "Riding into an inferno isn't exactly common behavior, even out west." One of the women stepped forward with a basket. "We've prepared the teachers' quarters for you, Mrs. Wilson. Fresh linens, some preserves, and other necessities to start you off." Rachel accepted the basket with genuine gratitude. "Thank you. I'm looking forward to beginning the school term." After a brief tour of the schoolhouse and further assurances of the community's support, the delegation departed, leaving Henry and Rachel alone in the small quarters that would be her home. The contrast between these humble rooms and his sprawling ranch house was stark. Though clean and functional, the space consisted of just 2 rooms, a combined kitchen and sitting area, and a small bedroom. Henry couldn't help but think how cramped it would become once the baby arrived. Rachel seemed to read his thoughts. "It's not what you're used to," she acknowledged. "But it will serve for now." Henry set down her trunk, which contained the few possessions she'd acquired since arriving in Hayes City, along with some clothes Mrs. Finch had insisted she take. "I'll arrange for more furniture to be delivered," he said, looking around at the sparse furnishings. "A proper rocking chair at least, and a better bed." Rachel stepped close to him, placing a hand on his arm. "Thank you for everything. These past days at your ranch have been extraordinary." Henry covered her hand with his own. "I meant what I said yesterday, Rachel. Take all the time you need, but know that my feelings won't change." Rachel's eyes softened. "I believe you, and I promise not to keep you waiting too long for an answer." Henry wanted to pull her into his arms to seal his proposal with a kiss, but restrained himself. Instead, he brought her hand to his lips in a gesture that was both respectful and intimate. "I'll call on you in a few days," he promised. "Sooner if you need anything at all." As Henry drove back to his ranch, he reflected on the strange turns life could take. 2 weeks ago, he had been a solitary man resigned to his bachelor existence. Now, he found himself fervently hoping to become a husband and father before the year's end. The town buzzed with speculation about Henry Galloway's frequent visits to the new schoolteacher. Every other day, his distinctive buggy could be seen parked outside the schoolhouse as he helped Rachel prepare her classroom for the coming term. On Sundays, they sat together at church, their growing closeness apparent to all who observed them. For Rachel, these weeks of courtship, for that was what it was, despite her not yet accepting Henry's proposal, were a revelation. She discovered in Henry a man of depth and character, whose gruff exterior concealed a thoughtful mind and gentle heart. He brought her books he thought she might enjoy, listened attentively to her ideas for the school, and never once made her feel that her pregnancy was a burden or complication. When the school term began in mid-August, Rachel found herself busy from dawn till dusk with 28 pupils ranging from 5 to 16 years of age. Despite the exhaustion that came with teaching while 7 months pregnant, she thrived on the work, drawing on reserves of energy she hadn't known she possessed. Henry adjusted his visits to accommodate her schedule, often arriving as classes ended to walk her home. He befriended the older boys who initially viewed him with suspicion, teaching them to track and sharing stories of his early days on the frontier that mysteriously led to improved behavior in the classroom. On a warm September evening, as they sat on the small porch of Rachel's quarters watching the sunset, Henry broached a subject they had both been avoiding. "The baby will come in about 2 months," he said quietly. "Have you thought about arrangements?" Rachel rested her hand on her now prominent belly. "Mrs. Carpenter has offered to attend the birth, and several of the mothers have volunteered to help afterward." Henry shifted in his chair to face her more directly. "Rachel, I've respected your need for time. But I must ask, have you reached a decision about my proposal?" Rachel met his gaze steadily. Over the past weeks, she had examined her feelings carefully, weighing her growing attachment to Henry against the memory of Thomas and her concerns about marrying so soon after widowhood. "I have," she said simply. "My answer is yes, Henry, I will marry you." The joy that transformed his features was beautiful to behold. He reached for her hands, holding them tenderly. "You've made me the happiest man in Kansas," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When? How soon can you be ready?" Rachel laughed at his eagerness. "Well, I'd prefer before the baby comes. Perhaps in 2 weeks. That would give us time to prepare and for me to arrange for a substitute teacher." Henry nodded, already planning. 2 weeks, October 1st. "I'll speak to Reverend Collins tomorrow." They spent the next hour discussing practical arrangements where they would live at the ranch, with Rachel making the daily journey to school until her confinement. How they would announce their engagement, a simple notice in the town paper, and whether they wanted a large ceremony, they did not. Only close friends would be invited. As twilight deepened into night, Henry reluctantly rose to leave. At the door, he hesitated, then bent to kiss Rachel for the first time, a gentle, questioning kiss that she returned with unexpected fervor. When they finally parted, both were breathless. 2 weeks suddenly seems very long, Henry murmured. Rachel touched his face, marveling at the turn her life had taken. We've waited this long. We can manage a fortnight more. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Hayes City. Most reactions were positive. The community had already embraced the narrative of the heroic rancher and the schoolteacher he had rescued from the fire. A few voices expressed concern about the hasty nature of the match, particularly given Rachel's condition, but these were largely silenced by Mrs. Finch's fierce defense of the couple. On October 1, 1872, in the newly repaired church of Hayes City, Rachel Wilson became Rachel Galloway in a simple ceremony attended by 20 of their closest acquaintances. She wore a dress of deep blue silk that Mrs. Finch had altered to accommodate her pregnancy and carried a bouquet of late wildflowers gathered from the prairie. Henry, dressed in a new suit ordered from Kansas City, watched his bride walk toward him with an expression of such naked adoration that several of the attendees were moved to tears. The vows they exchanged were traditional but spoken with profound sincerity, each word a promise neither took lightly. The small reception afterward at the Galloway Ranch allowed the townspeople to see the home where their teacher would now reside. Mrs. Finch had outdone herself with the preparations, transforming the already handsome house into a celebration of new beginnings. Flowers adorned every surface, tables groaned with food, and even the ranch hands had been pressed into service as waiters, their usual dusty attire replaced with clean shirts and awkward smiles. As the last guests departed and twilight settled over the ranch, Henry led his new wife to the master bedroom, now redecorated to reflect both their tastes. Rachel had spent several days before the wedding arranging her belongings, but entering as Mrs. Galloway gave the room a different significance. "Welcome home," Henry said softly, closing the door behind them. "Truly home this time." Rachel turned to him, her face glowing with happiness despite her fatigue. "It feels right being here with you, as if this is where I was always meant to be." Henry drew her gently into his arms, mindful of her condition. "I never thought I'd have this chance again to build a life with someone to love and be loved. Nor did I," Rachel admitted, resting her head against his chest. "When Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. I came west expecting only to find a quiet place to raise my child alone. Instead, you found yourself running from a fire," Henry said with a touch of his dry humor. Rachel laughed softly. "And you found yourself riding into one. Perhaps we're both a little reckless." "Or perhaps," Henry suggested, tipping her face up to his, "we simply recognize what's worth risking everything for." Their kiss sealed this truth, and the night that followed was one of tender discoveries and profound connection that transcended physical desire. They spoke long into the night, sharing hopes and fears, mapping the contours of their new life together. In the weeks that followed, they settled into a rhythm that accommodated both their needs. Henry drove Rachel to school each morning on his way to town for business, and either collected her himself in the afternoon or sent one of his men with the buggy if he was detained. Rachel continued teaching until early November, when Dr. Maxwell insisted she begin her confinement. She turned her classroom over to Miss Peterson, the minister's daughter, with detailed lesson plans and reluctant farewells from her students. The waiting time was filled with preparations for the baby. Henry converted a room adjacent to their bedroom into a nursery, personally crafting a cradle from cherry wood that Mrs. Finch lined with soft blankets. Rachel sewed tiny garments in the evenings while Henry read aloud from his favorite books, creating a peaceful domesticity neither had dared hope for months earlier. On a snowy December morning, Rachel's labor began. Henry, despite Mrs. Finch's attempts to banish him to the study as was customary, refused to leave his wife's side. He held her hand through hours of pain, wiped her brow, and murmured encouragement as she fought to bring their child into the world. "Our child," Rachel had insisted when he referred to the baby as hers. This baby will be yours in every way that matters, Henry." When at last the infant's cries filled the room, it was Henry who wept first. The healthy boy, red-faced and indignant at his abrupt entry into the world, was placed in Rachel's arms while Henry looked on in wonder. "Thomas Henry Wilson Galloway," Rachel announced, her exhausted face radiant, "to honor the past and celebrate the future." Henry touched his son's tiny hand with reverent fingers. "He's perfect, and so are you, Mrs. Finch," wiping away tears of her own, declared it was time for the mother to rest. She took the baby to clean and swaddle him, leaving the new parents a moment alone. Henry sat on the edge of the bed, taking Rachel's hand and bringing it to his lips. "I never imagined such happiness was possible," he said softly. "Thank you for giving me this gift, for trusting me with your heart and your child." Rachel's eyes filled with tears of joy. "It was you who gave me the greater gift, Henry. You rode through fire to save us before you even knew us. And in doing so, you saved me in more ways than one." Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the prairie in a blanket of pristine white. Inside the Galloway home, a family born of courage, compassion, and unexpected love celebrated their new beginning. 5 years later, on the anniversary of the prairie fire that had brought them together, Henry and Rachel Galloway stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching their children play in the summer twilight. Thomas, now a sturdy 5-year-old with his mother's auburn hair and his adoptive father's determined chin, raced around the yard with his 3-year-old sister Elizabeth, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Rachel, her hand resting on the slight swell of her stomach that signaled another addition to their family in the coming winter, leaned against her husband's solid warmth. "You ever think about how differently our lives might have turned out?" she asked, watching as Thomas pretended to rescue Elizabeth from imaginary flames, a game inspired by the story of their parents' meeting that had become family legend. Henry's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Sometimes. But then, I remember something my father once told me, that the measure of a life well lived isn't the absence of fire, but who walks through the flames with you." Rachel turned in his embrace to face him, noting the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair and the laugh lines that now framed his eyes. To her, he was more handsome now than on the day they wed. "I would walk through fire for you," she said softly, "just as you did for me." Henry bent to kiss her, still marveling at the miracle of their love. "Let's hope we never have to test that again," he murmured against her lips. "But if we do, we'll face it together," Rachel finished for him, "as we've faced everything since that night." As darkness settled over the Kansas prairie, the Galloway family gathered in their home, a home built not just of wood and stone, but of courage, second chances, and a love that had been forged in fire and grown stronger with each passing year.